Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a real, high-stakes medical mystery. We're going to look at the incredibly surprising and frankly fascinating connection between your ears and your cognitive health. You know, for decades, we've kind of just thought of hearing loss as a frustrating but mostly harmless part of getting older. But recent scientific investigations have completely flipped that idea on its head, revealing that it might actually be an active participant in one of the absolute most feared conditions of aging. Okay, let's jump right into the data with this one. 8%, a staggering 8% of global dementia cases are estimated to be directly attributable to hearing loss. When you think about the millions upon millions of people affected by cognitive decline worldwide, 8% is just a massive, life-altering number. In fact, experts now consider it the leading, potentially modifiable risk factor for dementia.
And that brings us to a really provocative question, one that is fundamentally reshaping how we approach aging research right now. What if one of the absolute biggest risk factors for dementia is actually something we can change? What if, by simply treating our ears, we could literally shield our brains? Well, to understand how that's even physically possible, we need to look under the hood.
So let's look at Section 1, the anatomy of the crime scene, ear versus brain. To solve this mystery, we first need to deconstruct how hearing actually works, because it is very much a two-part system. The really critical distinction here is the division of labor. On one side, you've got peripheral auditory function. That's the mechanical ear, the eardrum, the little bones, the cochlea, and its only job is just to detect raw sound waves from your environment. But on the flip side, you have central auditory function. That's the neurological brain, and its job is to decode those raw sounds into actual meaning. Both of these parts have to work perfectly in tandem for you to, say, understand a conversation in a noisy restaurant. So, what happens when things start to go wrong? Well, with age-related hearing loss, the tiny sensory cells in the inner ear become progressively damaged, and unfortunately, they cannot regenerate. But here's the key. It doesn't just turn the volume down on the world. Actually, scratch that. It's more like a bad radio signal. It distorts high-frequency sounds. It scrambles the crispness of consonants like S, F, and TH. So your peripheral ear is detecting sound, sure, but it's sending a corrupted, garbled, totally muddled signals straight up to your central brain to figure out.
Moving right along to Section 2, the evidence, a global epidemic.
Before we look at how to fix this, we really need to look at the epidemiological data to understand just how massive this sensory crisis is. Currently, 1 in 5 people globally, that is over 1.5 billion individuals, are living with some degree of hearing loss. Just think about that. That's a huge portion of the global population walking around right now with a degraded auditory signal.
And the trajectory we're on is incredibly steep. By the year 2050, researchers project a staggering 2.5 billion people will be affected. That means nearly 1 in 4 individuals on the planet will have some degree of hearing loss.
And beyond the obvious physical and emotional toll, the financial numbers are just mind-boggling. The annual global economic cost of unaddressed hearing loss has reached $980 billion, almost $1 trillion. And no, that's not just the cost of medical devices. That is primarily driven by lost productivity in the workplace, increased rates of hospitalizations, and other excess medical costs.
But the most damning piece of evidence linking this whole epidemic to cognitive decline comes straight from the Lancet Commission. They found that older adults with hearing loss face nearly double the risk, 1.9 times greater risk to be exact, of developing incident dementia compared to folks with normal hearing. It's a connection we literally just cannot ignore anymore.
All right, Section 3, 3 suspects, pathways to decline.
The absolute crucial point we need to figure out is exactly how degraded ears lead to a degraded mind. Researchers have isolated 3 main suspects, 3 specific physiological pathways they are actively investigating to determine if hearing loss actively causes dementia or if they're just tragic, simultaneous coincidences. Let's walk through this lineup.
Suspect number 1 is the sensory deprivation hypothesis. This is essentially your classic use it or lose it dynamic. When the brain is starved of clear auditory stimulation over a prolonged period, it actually leads to physical changes. We're talking reduced gray matter density and actual volume loss in the brain's temporal lobe. The brain literally reorganizes itself and atrophies when it isn't being fed clear sound.
Then we have suspect number 2, information degradation, which hinges entirely on this fascinating concept called cognitive load. Because your brain is receiving a garbled signal from the ear, it has to use intense mental effort and massive cognitive resources just to decode that impoverished sensory input. And this leads to an amazing way to visualize what's actually happening in your head.
I want you to think of your brain literally like a smartphone battery. If your brain is working overtime, just completely draining its battery to guess muffled words in a noisy room, it drains the limited cognitive energy it needs for other vital tasks. It's stealing processing power away from things like memory and executive function. Over time, this constant daily cognitive strain can completely deplete your buffer against cognitive decline.
And let's move to suspect 3, the common cause hypothesis. This builds on the idea that, hey, maybe one isn't causing the other. Rather, an underlying issue, like systemic vascular disease, overall neural degeneration,